Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Unleashing DePIN Podcast. My name is Tyler. I am your host. And like always, I am very excited for this next conversation. I think it's fairly safe to assume that, number one, you have probably heard about the project that these kind folks are associated with who are joining me today. And I think it's also safe to say that if it wasn't for a lot of the efforts that they're doing, there's a good chance we probably wouldn't be here having this conversation. So with all of that being said, I am really excited to have Abhay and Scott from Helium on the podcast. Gentlemen, welcome on. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Perfect. So just for introductions to get everything kicked off, I'm sure people are familiar with both of yourselves as well as Helium, of course. But for those that are maybe tuning in that haven't heard, can you give a little bit of introduction around who you are, kind of your background, how you got into the space, and then we can jump into everything Helium from there.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Oh, cool. So, thanks for having us on today. So kind of the quick background on me. So Scott Sigel, COO of Helium Foundation. So we are the nonprofit steward of the Helium Network, which, we've been building wireless networks since 2019, kind of a bottoms up community built network model. The idea of how do you kind of think about creating ubiquitous coverage for all through crypto communities can enable that. So our organization is the nonprofit steward on that. My background, I've been scaling traditional venture companies since earlier in my career. Went full-time crypto in 2017. I was actually working with a really technical team of cryptographers. This is back when, the wave of centralized exchange hacks. So I was working on trustless settlement was my foray into the space. Ended up coming into the Helium community while I was working on another project, kind of was, minor, love the idea, always kind of been a radio nerd in general, especially on audio side, but really started putting together the basic pieces of foundation in 2020 and formalizing it in 21.
Amazing. Abhay, what about you?
So I started the Helium community back in 2019. I actually started as a hotspot owner. So I put up a hotspot in my sort of in places that I knew, right? Like my home, friends' houses, things like that. And I started building applications, joined the community, was loud about things about the protocol, wrote my first economic proposal, which is HIP 10, and kind of went from there. I guess, I've been part of the protocol team in some form since then. Worked independently first, joined the Nova Labs team for a couple of years, formally ran product, but also did everything like core blockchain, our migration to validators, migration to Solana, started the beginnings of the migration to Solana. And then, when we sort of separated the two responsibilities and made it more clear what the two companies were responsible for, it was clear that the foundation would be the home for the protocol itself. And so I joined the foundation back in 2022. I've been interested in crypto, I guess, generally speaking, since the early days of Bitcoin. Decided to, throw a bunch of random computers on doing this math problem thing back when I saw this thing on Hacker News many, many years ago. And that was sort of my start in crypto. For me, I've only really ever worked in Bitcoin and Bitcoin related things and Helium. So I kind of missed the boat on, quote unquote, missed the boat on everything else. But, really love what we are doing here. Ultimately, I think building a community built network means that an individual can sort of not only provide themselves connectivity, but also provide connectivity to all their neighbors, maybe all their customers at their business. I think this is the sort of promise of what crypto can do. And that's why I love working at Helium.
Yeah, that's incredible. No, it's been a fascinating journey to see all of the changes that have happened over the 5 years now since this sort of new model was put into place. And now we've got this term DePIN that we all sort of know and love, and all these projects that have followed suit, if you will. And so it's been a really fascinating journey. One of the really interesting things about Helium is that so much has changed since the early days with IoT and LoRaWAN and whatnot. And so I want to dive into a lot of the specifics, but for just a super cursory overview, can one of you give the state of Helium today with respect to the different SubDAOs, some of the different initiatives that are going on there? And then we can sort of unpack those in their specifics.
Yeah. I can give a little bit of historical context, and then if you want to jump in and kind of some of the kind of where we're going now. I kind of look at Helium as like we're in that kind of second wave of mature ecosystems. If you think of Bitcoin, Ethereum of that first wave, old enough that we have certainly iterated and improved significantly from lessons learned in our early days and really hitting our stride right now. you think about the original purpose of why the network started, and context for those who aren't familiar, Helium was not a blockchain project from the get-go. It was really around how do you kind of close that gap in connectivity for IoT or Internet of Things devices. So those sensors that are monitoring the soil out at farms or thinking about physical goods in transit, it's always been hard to build those networks from a centralized perspective. So when Helium launched as a decentralized protocol in 2019, the focus was completely around IoT. And we always talk about how do you solve that cold start problem in physical networks. It's the idea of how do you create that supply when the demand isn't necessarily there yet, and really validated that with how fast and how much the IoT network scaled, hundreds of thousands of hotspots, more than we needed in most of those geographies, to be totally candid. And some of the IoT hotspot setups, with the right setup, you're talking about miles of coverage for, these sensors that are out there. So today, again, still hundreds of thousands of connections with density and coverage, mostly in North America, in Europe markets, certain places in Southeast Asia, but you're talking about over 100 organizations that are running solutions on the IoT network today. And that's things like flood detection, air quality monitoring, and supporting some of the most innovative other teams in DePIN. So if you look at Demo or Hive Mapper, WeatherXM, the idea that Helium is that kind of underlying connectivity layer and sitting behind the scenes, that's so much of what I think the value we provide as a network and as a community. So IoT was really how Helium came to market, and starting in 2022, roughly, maybe even a little bit earlier, we started to have this conversation around network of networks. How do you take what is this massive physical footprint and this, thriving kind of social and economic coordination layer and start to think about what else you can build on top of that? And that's where kind of mobile came to be through conversations in the community, some of the major stakeholding organizations, and launching the mobile network alongside the IoT network. And now, again, flashing forward to today, you've got over 10,000 hotspots. More of where, again, thinking about where we've kind of grown and kind of learned from the initial launches, having demand lead supply. And now you can see with Helium Mobile Carrier up and running, and that's a Nova Labs product, over 100,000 subscribers have signed up there. So you're talking about real world utility of crypto built networks on something that is very user friendly, very intuitive. And that value allows us, and this is where I think DePIN's been so successful. Like, it's all about expanding the pie. How do you bring the value of these networks to the masses in a way that they don't have to always understand? They don't have to understand the intricacies, but the economic benefit and the ability to have that agency to create your own coverage and to deploy your own wireless networks. We're seeing that succeed now, and the volume of use cases speak to that. So I think that's kind of brought us to where we are now, which is still, again, a 2-year in development on this network of networks concept of you can build more on top of the physical network that the Helium community has created. Excuse me. And yeah, Abhay, I don't know if you want to kind of jump on kind of where we are now and where we're going.
I mean, I think the most interesting thing about where we're going is probably this sort of opportunity for the network to continue to expand into new verticals. I think, one of the things I've been thinking about over, the last few years is, is this a platform for building just wireless networks, just data networks, or could it really be for any physical infrastructure network? And that's, this proposal that came out, and I'm sure we'll get into it. But this proposal that came out just a couple of weeks ago from the Sourceful team, kind of forced that conversation, really. And the thing I like about it the most is that, or one of the things I like about it the most is that it sort of pushes us all the way to that edge, to really test out, what are the things that we need to do as a platform to enable that.
Yeah, I think that the conversation around sort of a network of networks is super fascinating. And one of the core tenets that I think we'd all agree is been a driver of that is sort of the governance model. So before we start diving into the specifics of these different new networks that you're building, I'd love to unpack kind of the Helium governance model a little bit. It's been sort of a beacon for other projects to emulate and look at as a resource. Ironically, in this interesting political landscape, we're seeing a lot of breakdowns, if you want to call them that, with respect to how we do governance and kind of our normal day-to-day lives. And so it's been really fascinating to see that not only scale, but also develop and sort of mature over time. Can you unpack how that Helium governance model has played a role or been sort of a driving factor in the success of the project over and above just the network rollouts and deployments, but really specifically unpack the governance side of things a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. And, I think one thing that might be useful for your listeners is that, what is our role in all of this as well, right? What is the foundation's role in all of this? The foundation, just to like put it out there, the foundation's job is to enable governance. We're not necessarily the ones that are proposing everything, although we may propose things. We're not necessarily the ones that vote in things. In fact, we actually, as a foundation, haven't voted in any proposals yet. Although we could, we are a token holder, and if we wanted to lock tokens and do that, I think we would be sort of well within our rights to do so. And, I think that, our job, though, number one is to start the conversation, drive the conversation, get to an understanding of where the community is on whether or not this needs a formal vote, and then actually drive through the vote process and sort of all the sort of social bits around that, but also all the technical bits around that. Like we write governance smart contracts, we built a governance platform, we've done all of those things. But kind of like to go back to where we started, generally speaking, Helium has always been a rough consensus governance system. We started off with, this is back in 2019 days, like we had a giant shared Slack channel. It was, it's really special, with Slack channels, like, if you ever use a community Slack channel, there's a limit to how much history you can keep, just because otherwise you have to pay for every single user, and that really wasn't scaling. But, back then we had Slack channels, and we did plus minus votes in chat. Like that's how we did stuff. Now, when we moved to Discord, it was roughly the same thing, except in Discord instead. And now we didn't have that sort of chat history problem anymore. So yeah. And so that's sort of like where we started. But, both of those systems really are still, a rough consensus system. The readers of that, typically protocol developers, would have to look at the outcome of one of those kinds of votes and see if the community sort of generally, agrees that something needs to be built a certain way. And that's, we introduced, and so after doing that for a couple of years, like over a weekend, basically, I threw together the first version of Helium Vote, which was, what if we took that and then put it on chain? And, in my, like, at the time, like kind of my understanding of governance systems, especially for blockchains, that there's two kinds of governance. There's explicit governance, that is, a node is sort of, think like Bitcoin style, like a node is signaling a capability, and enough nodes are signaling that capability, like the network will soft fork into a particular, a new sort of set of capabilities for this network. So that's a sort of explicit, like every node operator is sort of signaling their intent, and the network sort of migrates naturally and hopefully seamlessly. It's the soft fork. But I think that I love that kind of governance model, to be honest. It's funny for me and the Helium community to say this, because we have a sort of slightly different governance model, but minimal governance and sort of ossified protocols have a lot of value, if you're thinking of certain kinds of activity. But developing protocols, and ones that are still sort of in the early stages of like, figuring out what its role is and how to reward certain activities, and that are constantly evolving, new networks are being built on Helium, need more flexibility. And so that's sort of why we have this sort of rough consensus model still to this day. So we built Helium Vote. It was a way to do stuff on chain. Several votes actually went through that. The first one, I think, was a redenomination HIP, which passed, and then later was revoked. And then, and several other HIPs went through this process. When we moved to Solana, we had to start again. And we started with using a well-known system on Solana called SPL governance, and using the front end called Realms, which is like, it's governance in a box, right? It gives you a sort of single vault wallet for a protocol to be able to store tokens, and then a set of governance primitives that let you sort of decide what you want to do with those tokens, and sort of any other changes you might want to make to protocols. And that works for a lot of DAOs on Solana, I think. And if you just want the thing exactly as it's designed, and it's fairly prescriptive on certain things, I think it's great, and you should probably use it. But we were hitting some limits around this, and so we ended up writing our own governance system from scratch. We looked at a couple of other things out there. There was the Sabin protocol had their own governance system called Tribeca. The Jet protocol had their own governance system. There are other like very sort of light versions. We could have gone back to what we did with Helium Vote, where you had to burn DCs for it. There are a couple of different versions of this, but we ultimately ended up to build this modular governance system that sort of is what we believe right for our kind of network, where you have lots of different stakeholders and lots of different counterparties, and you want them all to be able to sort of participate on chain for important governance, important protocol changes that are coming.
Sure. Have there been any aspects of the modular governance that has surprised you or been an externality that was just something positive that you didn't initially foresee as you've expanded from sort of just the IoT side to migrating onto Solana and then bringing in these other sub-DAOs like, with mobile, and then we've got the energy sub-DAO, obviously, that we can talk about in a bit. But have there been things with respect to governance in particular that have been surprising or interesting to you?
I think the thing that I find pretty awesome is the level of participation that we see in our community. I think that in general, voting systems are hard, right? And, even in-person voting systems, knowing that, a vote represents a particular kind of actor, is still tough. And there's always like sort of concerns around this, with all sorts of voting systems. There's also, is the person voting, or is the sort of position that's voting long-term aligned with the protocol? I think this is also tough to do. And these are things that we tried to solve with our, V token model. I think, but ultimately I find that our community is probably one of the more active communities that are out there. I think the only other ones that are out there that they're fairly active are the sort of small DAOs. The small like collection DAOs are also pretty active. But, given the size of our network, we have hundreds of thousands of hotspots deployed all over the world, hundreds of thousands of active wallets in our ecosystem. The level of participation here, I think, is really unmatched. Given that size.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, it really has spoken to kind of like the durability of the community overall. The dedication to thinking about scale economics, at this stage of the game, just reflects in the people that have been here for a while. Like any community, you're always going to have kind of a very vocal minority, but it's fascinating to see kind of sometimes the emergence of almost like, crypto political parties of what is the right level of permissionlessness, optimizing for growth versus, being on the other side of completely neutral from day one with certain types of certain areas of the kind of like the framework and the structure. So I think in general, that one of the most exciting things has been how much the community really deeply cares. And, we have very healthy debate, sometimes not as healthy, but for the most part, it's great to see how much the distinct geographies, the distinct use cases all kind of come together for the betterment of the network and the mission overall.
Yeah, well, as someone who's passively observing within, Discord and seeing these conversations, it's inspiring, fascinating, and also sort of reiterates the challenge that we have in these decentralized mechanisms where people have different opinions. And you're right, sustaining this sort of the short term versus the long term benefits. I think the approach has been well implemented to be able to sort of balance those two things, but it is certainly a difficult proposition to solve for people. Outside of just governance and some of the SubDAO things, which I really want to dive into the energy side next, this is an open question for either of you two. Are there other applications or projects right now that are built on top of Helium that are getting you excited, that you think, wow, this is a super novel use case, and you're excited about those synergies that are developing between the two?
Yeah, I think that, at a very, very macro, I'll give you kind of both, the macro perspective, you think about last mile connectivity. It's not there's necessarily a silver bullet, but when you think about the idea of offload in general. So whether you're talking about IoT networks, mobile networks, again, it's only a proposal stage right now, but even the idea of the promise of what might potentially come with an energy network or any other sub-DAO is, how do you kind of close that gap between centralized models and kind of ground up community models? I think that's going to be super important for all of these traditional utilities is you're trying to get to ubiquitous wireless for all. Well, you can't rely on, a large central provider because they're always going to be thinking on return on investment. It's the idea that a localized community, whether that's a small business cafe or somebody who is living in a largely rural environment, has the agency and ability to create that coverage and provide roaming capability for a larger carrier or a larger service provider, that's really, I think, one of the biggest pieces of value here for any utility is how do you make sure you close these gaps with community-built networks? So from a macro perspective, that's the thing that's exciting to me is like, how does nobody get left behind on these different types of utilities? It's always going to be an important kind of focus for the overall community. So I'm excited that we're for fulfilling that promise on a regular basis. And you kind of look at the carrier offload numbers of kind of what's going on with Helium Mobile. Micro, there's always little kind of fun surprises and stuff that comes up that, we didn't have on our radar. Very nuanced niche things like historical artifact preservation. That's not a thing that we would have thought of, but, the idea that we've got, one of the IoT service providers in Europe who was working with, I think it was either a library or a museum, and they were, it was like they had a flood issue or there was kind of water leakage, and that, these sensors that were running on the network where there wasn't sufficient connectivity, that set up enough of a warning that they could go in and kind of take care of these things. So I think all these niche things, and that's kind of what's cool about the IoT side is you've got such a diversity of these solutions. Back in the day, there was somebody who was smart manhole covers for municipality solutions. That stuff's always exciting for me, for the community in general.
I mean, there's also like a service provider out there that's protecting a Picasso right now, and IoT network. That's pretty cool. I think for security reasons, they can't say what it is or which one it is. But I think it's incredible. Pretty cool to think about.
Yeah, that's amazing. It is incredible to see these different applications and use cases that can be built upon just having ubiquitous connectivity or coverage, regardless of sort of the network type or the wireless type. It's really fascinating. So we've talked a lot about kind of the history of Helium, the governance, where you're at. One of the newest additions or things that we get a chance to chat about is the introduction or sort of the conversation around this energy SubDAO. And you already touched on this a little bit, Abhay, but what was really the driving factor that changed from sort of servicing these wireless needs with, the IoT and then obviously mobile into becoming the PIN, if you want to call it that, with energy? Maybe we can unpack that, then we can dive into really what is the whole point of this energy SubDAO.
Yeah, I mean, I think the realization that some of us had inside of the sort of Helium ecosystem, myself included, was that this network that we've built is not just about the tokens that have been launched. It's not just about the smart contracts that were written. It's not about the economics for wireless, but it's also things like the sort of social aspect of this community that we've built, and that is, kind of the most important thing, I would argue, for physical infrastructure networks, because without the actual folks deploying it, it's kind of pointless. It's like Airbnb without hosts, right? Like, what's the point? And so, I think that realization is kind of where teams of sort of all kind of come around to this idea that Helium is a launch pad. It's a platform to be able to create these kinds of networks, because Helium has kind of some unfair advantages, right? It has this enormous community. It has an established set of economics. It has a foundation like ours that's willing to talk about them, and it's valuable to us to be able to talk about these kinds of networks being built in general, and especially being built on Helium, because we can sort of paint the bigger picture of why this style of deploying infrastructure is sort of both different and also complementary to existing ways of deploying infrastructure. When we go and talk to members of Congress, we can not only talk about wireless connectivity, we can talk about, in this case, we could talk about energy, and we could talk about other kinds of applications that are being built in a different way, and, actually providing value to constituents. And that's ultimately what a congressperson wants to, really talk about. It's like how it's helping my community.
Yeah. Actually, it's funny. We really talked, this conversation goes back to 2022. Yeah. So once we were in, this is for the folks that have been more involved, HIP 51 and 52 and 53, we're all about the idea of kind of expanding the utility of the network, thinking about this network of networks concept. And at that point, it was mostly the focus on the wireless side. But, as Abhay was talking about, when you've got this massive physical footprint, when you've got the social and the economic coordination, I think we're at this early stages of talking more about DePIN composability, like the things that are already out there that exist that can be leveraged by other teams, where you end up with these kind of symbiotic wins, where other teams don't need to think quite as much about some of the cold start side, and it's also more value accruing to this global community. So generally speaking, again, it's to see this kind of hitting its next step beyond what the conversation was 2 years ago. It's validating, I think, what a lot of us were thinking back then.
Yeah, it's amazing. For those that are coming up to speed on really the purpose or some of the intent behind the Energy SubDAO, can you, from a kind of a 500-foot view, can you unpack really what the goal is, really what sort of some of the important considerations might be, just for folks that are trying to understand how this fits into the broader context of Helium in general?
Yeah, I can sort of give the first stab at it. Really, it'd be great to actually have Frederick or any of the Sourceful team, have a chance at this too. For me, it's interesting because what the end goal here is that individuals, I can put a solar panel on my roof, I can put a battery in my garage or in my basement. I can maybe have a water heater that's also connected. All these devices, either push or pull energy from the grid that's around me, from my neighborhood, and from my city. And I think the coordination of these kinds of activities has gotten pretty hard because of the change in the way that we are generating and using energy. And this some of this was introduced by sort of the advent of rooftop solar and the fact that we have this opportunity to generate a significant amount of energy. Some of this is sort of the demands that come from EV and EV charging. Some of this is like, needing more AI compute, maybe even, right? Like these are all related, and the grid is, the sort of grid as a whole is very old, right? And it's not really designed for already distributed energy resources, both from a consumption side and from a production side. And so, the biggest thing that the Energy Subnetwork and other networks like this that are interested in building the space are trying to do is to solve that coordination problem. And the way that they're doing that is two things. One, enable all these kinds of devices to be connected and actually coordinated. And two, incentivize them to both either produce more or curtail, and then sort of use less. Both of those actions sort of do similar things to grids. And that's, the sort of two parts of that is incentivizing data and availability of the data on what's actually possible within a, in a neighborhood or in a region, and then actually act on those kind of data sets. And these are like at the base level what, these kinds of networks can do. And, this is not a new concept. This concept of a virtual power plant has been around for a while. And, I've had my house for, not quite a decade, but for a little while. And, there's been these concepts, like there's a company out there called Ohm Connect, and there are other companies around there who are really trying to convince people to do things like curtailment. And, at least in the United States, our grid, can only think about things in a very, very macro scale, right? So, I'm in California. CalISO runs our grid roughly. We have sort of operators inside of the grid, but, roughly the entire energy market sort of managed by CalISO. In Texas has their own ISO. And in the Midwest, there's an enormous one of these that sort of stretches all the way from Montana all the way. I think Kentucky is now no longer part of it, but, almost all the way to Kentucky, certainly through Ohio. And that's an enormous space. Think about distributed energy resources in a land area that's that large with different kinds of demand and supply. You have everything from solar to wind to oil and gas to coal, to just every kind of version of production, and then every kind of demand as well in that space. And so really the Energy Subnetwork is really about, is a coordination layer for these kinds of decentralized or really already distributed energy resources.
That's fascinating. Scott, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think I covered most of it, but it's kind of, it doesn't actually, it's not that far off from the kind of way that we think about wireless too, of, these things as individuals don't necessarily move the needle, but when you can talk about them, when you can kind of consider the the data in the aggregate, or the idea that there are cohorts out of this. It's how do you manage connectivity for an area? How do you manage energy for an area? One household, it's not necessarily meaningful, but to look at how how utility can think about that kind of distribution and management, and how you can kind of toggle these larger cohorts of energy producers that are coming from residential or small business. Like, that just becomes very, very interesting. Like, that is such a value for the incumbents right now, because that's a problem they're facing. I think that's one of the powerful things on any of the Helium networks is we are confronting problems that the incumbents and that legacy are facing right now, whether that is how to manage the ever-increasing demand for power, or that ever-increasing demand for data and wireless. So I think this really, it very much is in line with kind of the Helium ethos in general of, again, solving from a kind of bottoms-up perspective and enabling that through economics, through social coordination.
I think the part that Scott said there at the end is maybe the answer to why blockchains or why crypto, right? This kind of coordination is either very, very hard, or actually more so really very, very expensive, because of the amount of bureaucracy that you'd have to create to sort of have this kind of coordination if it was a centralized authority. Like, I don't think it's possible to do it, to align the incentives of every one of these individuals with this kind of collective goal.
Sure. It does become sort of the secret sauce, and really the power behind crypto and blockchain, and you're seeing it play out in real time, especially as you're interfacing with these incumbents that are needing new ways of being able to, provide wireless or power and what have you. It's super fascinating to see that translate into sort of the real-time adoption and proclamation of these networks, which is amazing. Abhay, you touched on maybe a potential new SubDAO, and I'm not suggesting by any means that this is in the works or coming, but are there, from the foundation side at least, are you looking at new introductions of SubDAOs that might continue this network of networks concept?
I think right now it's all of the above. Like, there's every sort of physical infrastructure network, or at least I would say every major category that is out there, compute and connectivity and energy and other kinds of things that make sense to be coordinated at this scale. We are having different kinds of conversations with everything from, hey, how does this look like in general, and how do I build this from scratch, to, does this make sense within the Helium ecosystem, and using Helium as the base network for this. And that's pretty exciting. I think that when we thought about this concept, HIP 51 introduced this concept really of a network of networks. We wanted that to happen over time, but it really does require a team to be subject matter experts that want to launch it this way, right? I think it is. I don't think the foundation should be the one coming up with all of these, really, to be honest. In fact, if we did, it just kind of defeats the purpose of all this. Sure. And so I think, what I would see, what I'd love to see are more teams like Sourceful, kind of putting in the work, and they really have put in the work, I would say, with our community over the last couple of weeks, really sort of, one, introducing what distributed energy resources are. Like, that's a brand new concept for a lot of folks. And two, sort of introducing why it makes sense, as a crypto project, as a blockchain project. And then three, how this fits into the Helium ecosystem as a whole. Those are the rough steps, right? That any new team would have to do. And that's sort of the advice that I've given to a lot of teams that I'm talking to.
That's fantastic. Where do you see the SubDAO ecosystem going in maybe 12 months or so? How do you see this sort of evolving over time?
If I knew that, I'd not be in this job. I'm not a good predictor. To be clear, I think this network of networks concept doesn't work as well if we were just two networks, and I think this is a realization that we had from the start, because we wanted to be very open. But it takes, I think this is the first example of another team bringing their network to us. And so we're learning a lot about what it takes to actually onboard one of these things. It's not write a HIP and you're done, right? That's for sure. Even if the HIP is perfect, it's still not that. There's a lot of technical lift. There's a lot of organizational lift that needs to happen, that to make this even possible. And so I think, we don't have a playbook yet. And so that's why I don't want to say, hey, we'll have 10 SubDAOs by the end of the year or something like that. First of all, that's wild. I don't have enough time in the day to do that.
I think, I feel like it took us, in reality, look, like from the introduction of this concept, it's 2 years until we feel like we have again, it's just kind of stars aligning of, the right team that has been in the ecosystem actively involved, again, just as miners and providing coverage for a few years now. So having empathy and understanding for the Helium ecosystem, bringing their own network, their own utility, the idea that there is, again, I always think about value accruing to the community, because one of the things that's exciting about this concept is, how does everybody become their kind of own utility conglomerate? Because the idea of you've got this physical presence, you're participating in this coordination layer. What value can we bring to the world beyond wireless? And I think that's, it's a thoughtful approach that shouldn't be rushed. And while we might work with, dozens of other DePIN projects as that kind of underlying connectivity layer, I think that it's going to be we'll figure out what makes sense in terms of that criteria and what's a proper fit for another subnetwork. So, as Abhay said, we don't know. We're still kind of building out what the roadmap looks like, but I think we've come a long way in 2 years.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's super interesting specifically with your guys' decorated history and background within the space is that you've probably got quite a bit of scar tissue and a lot of hard lessons learned just by trying things, implementing different ideas and whatnot, especially as it's scaled to a very large footprint, whether you're talking about IoT or the wireless, and as you transition into other sub-DAOs, that'll continue to grow. But one question I had was, for DePIN founders and projects that are looking to get off the ground, that are seeing the success of Helium or seeing sort of the success of this DePIN model, do you have any advice or any tips that you would sort of share with these prospective builders to help them do things maybe the right way, or maybe mistakes that they shouldn't replicate that maybe were done historically? Is there anything that you're able to share for builders that are interested in going all in on DePIN?
A lot. Where to start? I think, like one of the things, and this is again probably because the two of us come from like traditional venture ourselves, is still the idea of building things of value. I think that's where DePIN really has to hold itself accountable to. How are you expanding the pie? Like, what is crypto enabling in that specific case? It's enabling scalability and coordination in a way that wasn't possible before. What is a multiplier on the existing solutions? And I think kind of being accountable to that's super important. I think UX really matters. One of the things that, again, so Nova Labs, which is the founding team behind the network, one of the things I always applaud is like they really consumerized mining. It made it really multiplied the ability for folks to participate in the supply side of building out this physical network in a way that was not really as approachable as a Bitcoin or Ethereum miner. So I think with DePIN, like that UX matters so much. And, if you subscribe to the idea of progressive decentralization, one of the things that, probably wasn't the best move for us is we did a very good job kind of scaling supply because we built up this entire framework for an open third-party manufacturer ecosystem. So that meant you had a lot more suppliers, you could create healthy markets. But, and in our specific circumstance, it was taking a very, we really owning what that onboard experience looking like to kind of fragmenting that across a number of manufacturers. I think it was just too early to be doing that. So thinking about that UX, thinking about your relationship with other kind of manufacturers, stakeholders, that matters. Obviously economic alignment with stakeholders, but what do those relationships look like? Not just when things are in euphoria and you can count on kind of economic incentives, but when it's the next winter, when we're in the next kind of deep bear market, how do you make sure that you're holding, your partners or other aligned stakeholders accountable? How are they making sure they're providing services to the ecosystem? And just being mindful of that in general, the idea that, it really does take a village, and how do you make sure that these kind of key stakeholders are playing their role appropriately? I think that's some of the stuff that I'd be kind of thinking about. Yeah, I could go on for sure.
I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, the other thing that I would say to any founder is, who are you building for, and who's ultimately using the product, right? Like this is, for the IoT network, it was, you're building for applications that need connectivity in sort of varied locations or varying locations, right? Lots of different kinds of verticals built on top of the Helium IoT network. And the only way that you'll develop something on this Helium IoT network is if you have the largest possible network possible, like that there is. Otherwise, you're just not going to bother, right? Like I'm going to use something else, and I'll spend more money on, I'll put an extra battery in the sensor, or I'll spend more money on the hardware, or I'll spend more money on sort of ongoing connectivity, because I need to trust that this network is out there and it's accessible wherever I am. We're only starting to see that kind of organic development of on the IoT network now, because we're finally at that stage of like, it's stable, it's everywhere, and it's trustworthy, right? Like I can actually use it. And to be clear, like there's a lot more work for us to do to make it, permissionless, to be able to just, I have a sensor, I want to buy packets on the network, right? Like that's like, there's always more work to be done on that front. So on the mobile network, the demand is immediate, right? Like I have a phone, and my phone has Helium mobile service, right? And they have an entirely different problem, which is how do we make sure that this network has to make sure that it incentivizes coverage in areas where it's needed the most. Like where is a place where there's real demand for high bandwidth applications, where just using the T-Mobile network, or just using the Verizon or AT&T network, or any other network out there isn't sufficient, right? And where is this like actually providing like additional value? And can we do this at a lower cost and offer, a sort of better service at a lower cost? That's the only way that the mobile network will also grow. And that's, a very different way to think about networks. IoT needed connectivity everywhere. And it needs to be cheap and fast and easy to onboard. And mobile needs, it's more depth first in this case, right? Like let's make sure there's connectivity in very, very specific places, and a lot of it, so that users can depend on it there. And that's, I think, what new networks need to think about is, who's my net buyer ultimately, right, of my product, and what is the clear product, which is why I think that it's clear that we'll have a lot of folks kind of rushing into DePIN because there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to build businesses, but the ones that sort of last are the ones that like have a very, very clear buyer.
It's amazing. I think that's fantastic advice. Well, gosh, we have covered so many things, but between the history of Helium, where you've progressed and grown towards today, all the things that are coming ahead, I think everybody's really excited. But was there anything else that you wanted to add that we didn't get a chance to cover for folks who are listening that they need to be aware of, or just any other final thoughts you wanted to share here?
I think that I kind of go back again, kind of the DePIN composability side. I think that's the thing that, there should, I personally, I want more conversation around it. I think there's a lot of things that we've already found so much of working with other projects of how much there is, again, like it's tide raising all boats of how much we can be leveraging each other, the things that we're building, existing communities, the existing physical footprint from Helium. And that's where I'm excited to kind of see more inbound from new teams. We've already had some really rich conversations with folks, and it's just, it doesn't always have to be about subnetworks. It's just the idea of we're building more utility. We're showcasing the most practical value that, crypto networks can create. So part of it is from a development perspective, we can be working together more with more teams. But I think the other thing, especially for folks in the US, is like the story is so important right now to distinguish that, crypto is not an industry. It is a technology that can be used across industries. So one of the things that we do spend our time on is kind of the education advocacy. And we have really taken it upon ourselves to go beyond wireless into thinking about DePIN as an entire subsector and the utility around that. So to the extent that we're spending more time with legislators and policymakers, folks who can help facilitate those discussions, we want to hear more. So I think we take a lot of pride in kind of being a flag bearer for DePIN and for folks that are building real utility in crypto powered networks. So all I say is, reach out and let's figure out how we can do more together.
Amazing.
Go with that.
Yeah, let's go with that. I love it. Well, for those that are interested in either reaching out or wanting to stay up to date with everything that's going on in Helium, obviously there is a lot happening at the moment. Where should folks sort of tune in, stay in touch with everything that's happening?
I mean, say for the casual observers, obviously, there's the Helium and Helium Foundation Twitter handles. If you want to get more involved around things, governance, we can drop Discord links for you to throw in kind of in description text. But, in general, there's always hello@helium.foundation if anybody kind of wants to dig in a little deeper on, again, collaboration and other opportunities, or just kind of find us on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it these days. But no shortage of Helium channels.
And we'll be sure to link all of that below. We'll get the handles for Twitter, Discord, et cetera, so folks can stay up to date. Well, Abhay, Scott, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on. This is definitely an episode that I've been long excited to have. I'm grateful that we had a chance to do it now, especially as so much has changed over the course of at least when I started doing the podcast. So it's been amazing to see all the change that's happened and really continue the conversation for folks that are interested. So we will be sure to link all that information down below. But with that, we wanted to thank Abhay and Scott again for coming on, and we'll see everyone on the next one. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks, everyone.